Hey, welcome back to Fansball Profits. This is our Week 16 start sit video. By the way, if you made it this far, congratulations. You're probably playing in your fantasy championship. Good job, by the way. And so, before we get into this, we want to take a moment to say thank you to all you that have been part of the community the past about year and a half, 2 years. We appreciate that. Continue to help us build the community, and you can do that by continuing to watch, subscribe, like, let your friends know. The other thing we want to tell you is watch for our contest next week. It's a free contest and basically runs from week 17, the end of week 17, all the way through the Super Bowl. It's an opportunity for you to continue playing fantasy football and to win some free merchandise. Once again, it's a free contest. Keep your eyes open for that. Now, in these videos, we always say you need to contextualize the information, meaning every league is different. Scoring systems are different, bench size, etc. So we'll try to give you some basic information. We can help you make solid start-sit decisions. But if you have a specific question, put it at the bottom and we'll try to answer that. So if you have nothing else to add, should we get to our first game?
All right. All right, so here we come in our first game, and it's Titans versus Redskins. Now, first we look at Marcus Mariota, and he seems to have a lot of upside and a lot of downside, a very risky play. In his last 7 games, 4 of them, he's averaging like 23, 24 fantasy points a game. He's playing very well. He's got multiple TDs in all those games. And in the other games, he's averaging just 3 to 5 fantasy points a game with no touchdowns, and he just looks awful. For that reason, I don't think that you should start him. This is the fantasy championship week. I mean, this is it, guys, right? This is for all the marbles, as they say, and you really can't be taking a risk on a guy who could honestly get you 2 fantasy points in a game. While the Redskins do give up the 12th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, that's not really the Titans' game to have Marcus Mariota have a huge day. They're going to shut down that Redskins offense. They're going to run the ball, play defense. It should be a very low-scoring affair. That being said, on the other side, we go to Josh Johnson. You should sit Josh Johnson. Obviously, the Titans give up the 6th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. He's like, what, a 4th-string quarterback at this point. He hasn't been playing amazing. In fact, he's yet to throw for over 200 yards or a multiple touchdown day. So now, without wasting any time on that, we'll move to the running backs. Derrick Henry. Now, Derrick Henry has just exploded lately. He's got 11 rushing touchdowns in the last 8 games. And he looks phenomenal in standard leagues now. I can't move on without talking about him without mentioning the fact that he still makes me nervous. I don't trust him as a long-term option. But if you're a guy who is, James Conner, Melvin Gordon, or whatever the situation might be, right, where there's been all these crazy things happening with running backs, and you just need to get a guy in there this week that can get you something. In a standard league, Derrick Henry is an option, despite the fact that the Redskins give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to running backs. It's crazy to see that he has scored like 83 fantasy points over the last 2 games. He's been just insane. Well, I don't think he'll keep it up. He's not a safe play. He might be an option for somebody out there who's a little bit desperate. I understand sometimes we manage to get into the championship with not an ideal roster. On the other side, for the Redskins, really the only running back I'm going to mention is Adrian Peterson, and even him you should sit. Giants give up the fewest fantasy points to running backs, and although Peterson had 71 yards from scrimmage last week, which isn't bad, the Titans are phenomenal. They have the 12th best run defense in the NFL, allowing just 110 rushing yards per game, and so they are doing very, very good on that, especially, again, stopping running backs from the end zone, so you should sit Peterson. As far as the wide receivers go now, we come to Corey Davis. I don't know if necessarily you should play Corey Davis. At best, he's a wide receiver 3. Now, he does have a good matchup in that the Redskins give up the 7th most fantasy points to wide receivers, but he, much like his quarterback, has been very hot and cold. If Marcus Mariota has a huge game, Corey Davis could have some value, could have a big game, but half the time his quarterback doesn't throw any touchdowns, which leaves almost next to no room for him to have a big day. So I'm not a huge fan of Corey Davis this week either. On the other side, we see Jamison Crowder. Not here to say anything about Jamison Crowder's talent, how good he might be, or what his potential is. The fact of the matter is his quarterback situation is just not working out right now, and you should not play him for that reason. Now we go to the tight ends. The tight ends for the Titans are pretty banged up right now, and their top guy that they have is Anthony Firkshire. I'm probably messing his name up, but I really don't care. You should sit him. He's got a tough matchup against a team that gives up the 9th fewest points to tight ends. We go down to Jordan Reed. You should also sit him. The Titans give up the fewest fantasy points to tight ends, and he's really, really struggled lately. He's banged up with that toe injury, and honestly, it's been a while since he's had any huge games. Their Titans are allowing just 219 passing yards per game as well, so that should really limit them. You should sit both kickers, Ryan Suckup and Dustin Hopkins. And as far as the defenses go, I think that you should start the Titans defense and sit Washington.
So let's take a look at the Ravens versus the Chargers at this point. I want to talk about quarterback Lamar Jackson. So the Chargers are allowing the fourth fewest points to quarterbacks. Now, Lamar's only averaged 146 passing yards per game since he started, less than a touchdown per game since he started there. Without stating the obvious, the strength of his game is running the ball. I think we all obviously know that he's averaging 85 rushing yards per game during those starts. Last week I streamed him, actually, and he helped me advance to the championship game. With that said, I would advise sitting him this week, and here's why. One, they're playing the Chargers at home. They're playing very good football right now. And Lamar's lack of progress in the passing game makes him one-dimensional, and I think that's going to be difficult. I think we're going to see some challenges he's never faced before against the Chargers versus some other defenses he's faced. And here's why. Consider this. Lamar, in the 5 starts that he's had, he's averaged 21.18 points per game. But consider the fact that he faced some very bad defenses. He faced Cincinnati, Oakland, Atlanta, Kansas City, and Tampa Bay. And if you actually look at it, here's what you find out. They rank 28th, 29th, 30th, 31st, and 32nd in the NFL in points allowed per game. Those are the worst 5 defenses in the NFL in terms of how many points they allow per game. That's who he faced. Now he's going from facing the 5 worst defenses in the NFL, facing a top 5 defense, has Joey Bosa back and healthy once again. I would not trust the rookie this weekend playing the Chargers at home. Yes, he's got great legs. Yes, he's athletic. Yes, he's got potential. But this is Week 16, like Christian had said. Are you going to risk your championship on a guy like that? I personally wouldn't. I used him last week, but I would sit him this week if I was you. Look elsewhere. I'll talk about Phillip Rivers. So the Ravens allow these 6 fewest points to quarterbacks. So they're very tough. They're a very good defense. But Phillip Rivers is having his best season as a pro. Currently, his quarterback rate of 112.4 is the best that he's had. He's on pace for 35 touchdown passes. Should help, too, that Melvin Gordon is looking like he's going to be back this week. He was a full go in practice, so that's going to be a huge boost, but he might be missing Keenan Allen. And so he's a guy that if you have no other options out there, you could start him. I think he's a safe play, but he has a lower ceiling playing a good Ravens defense there. I would lower your expectations. Obviously, if Keenan Allen's out, that's a major setback for him. But once again, I think he's a solid veteran quarterback. I think he's had a very good season. I think that he's going to have a decent game. I don't think he's going to have a great game versus a very good Ravens defense there. So as running backs go, you have Melvin Gordon. So he was a full go in practice on Tuesday, so everything's pointing to him playing this week. Now he's playing the Ravens, allowing the second fewest points to running backs there. That doesn't matter how good they are against running backs. He's a must start. The guy is having a great year. In fact, he's averaging the 3rd most fantasy points per game among running backs in full PPR leagues at 26.15. He's having a phenomenal year before he missed some time. He's a full go. You got to start him. I know it's scary. I know there's questions. What if he re-injures himself? Will they limit his carries? There's a lot of question marks there, but I think you'd be foolish to sit him even in a difficult matchup there. So I would play Melvin Gordon. Now, as far as Gus Edwards goes, the Chargers allow the 10th most points to running backs. Now, in the last 5 games, he's averaging 19 carries per game and 97 rushing yards per game. And during that stretch, 3 times he was over 100 yards rushing. Now, he's not used much in the passing game. He's had 1 catch in 9 games. So his value is much, much lower in PPR leagues. But I would start him as a mid-range running back to in standards. And in PPR leagues, for me, he's a guy I'd probably lean towards sitting. Another reason why I think that he's devalued in PPR leagues is the development of Kenneth Dixon. So Kenneth Dixon is second-year running back. Since he's come back from his injury, the last 3 games, his carries went from 8 to 11. And during that stretch, a 5.3 yards per carry. He's been very effective, but he's got very good hands. He's a solid PPR guy. And so we're going to continue to see his role increased. And I think Gus Edwards' role will be decreased slightly. I think that Kenneth Dixon is more versatile back. He offers more in terms of that goes there. So when I look at Kenneth Dixon, what I would say is this. Kenneth Dixon is a guy that you could say is maybe you could start as a running back 3 in PPR leagues. As far as wide receivers go, you got Keenan Allen. Chargers coach Anthony Lynn believes that Keenan Allen hip could end up being a game time decision for Saturday. We'll have to monitor that as the week goes on. That might be a last second decision that you're going to have to make. Now, if he plays, he was on fire. This guy's been playing really good there. I would play him as a wide receiver 2. Now, the Ravens allowed the 3rd fewest points to wide receivers. Now, if you look at Mike Williams, the other wide receiver there for the Chargers, we actually said in last week's start sit video that he had sleeper appeal and that we advised as somebody that if he was out there that you could definitely look at playing. That was before Allen went down. Allen goes down in the game and he explodes. He gets 3 touchdowns and a 2-point conversion, giving him 10 touchdowns for the year. This is a former first round pick, 7th overall, who's a big, talented wide receiver. So here's what I would take as far as Mike Williams goes. If Allen sits, I would start Williams as a wide receiver 2. If Allen plays, he gets bumped down to a wide receiver 3/4, depending on your league size and your scoring system. That's kind of where I'm at with that. As far as wide receivers, John Brown, Michael Crabtree, and Willie Snead goes. Since Lamar has taken over at starter, Snead has been their best wide receiver. But if you look at his numbers over those 5 games that he started, he's averaging 4 catches and 35 receiving yards per game, which are far from good. None of those wide receivers are worth starting. I would sit them all. You can't trust any of them with Lamar at quarterback. As far as the tight ends on these teams go, I would sit them both. I wouldn't start any tight ends in this game. I would start both kickers in this one. I think that's a good kicker matchup. And then as far as defenses go, I like the Ravens. They're a good defense, but they're also playing Phillip Rivers in an offense that only allowing the 5th fewest points to defenses. So the Ravens play is an okay play, but it's not a great play this week. Try to find a better matchup if you can out there. And as far as the Chargers defense go, the Chargers defense, you'd think that it would be a good matchup versus a rookie quarterback there. But if you look at Lamar, the Ravens really like to limit his throws, and the throws they have him make are high percentage throws. He doesn't take a lot of risk. He doesn't allow a lot of sacks. He's mobile, stuff like that. There's a lot of reasons why it's just not a good play. So I'd probably advise sitting the Chargers defense in this one. Ryan, looks like you're up for the Bengals and the Browns.
Yeah, first of all, with quarterbacks, we're looking at Josh Driscoll for Cincinnati and Baker Mayfield for Cleveland. Now, one thing that I know both of you have talked about, we're looking at our fantasy championships, but also as far as NFL games go, we're looking at teams that are basically either they're still in the hunt or they're not in it at all. And for the Bengals, they're just not in it at this point. Josh Driscoll is definitely not a guy that I want to be starting this week. Obviously, he does a lot of things good with his legs, but his percentage of throws, his completion percentage is down. He doesn't throw a lot of touchdowns. He might be able to get one in the end zone on his legs, but we're definitely not going to be starting a guy like that. And the Browns actually give up the 12th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So that's actually a pretty solid matchup for the Browns defense, but definitely not starting any Bengals quarterbacks this week. As far as Baker Mayfield goes, I really like this guy. 270 yards passing, 2 touchdowns per game over the last 4 weeks. Last time he played against the Bengals, he put up 258 and 4 scores. They should be able to throw the ball, move the ball pretty easily against this Bengals defense, who has given up the 24th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. So it's a pretty good matchup. It's been a great matchup for teams all season long. I think they're one of the bottom 2 in the league as far as fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. So I'm definitely starting Baker Mayfield this week. I know it's kind of a crazy thing to say in your fantasy championships, but I have him as a top 10 play in all formats. Moving to the running backs, we're looking at Nick Chubb for the Cleveland Browns. Definitely starting Nick Chubb this week. The Bengals actually, once again, giving up quite a few points to opposing running backs. So their defense is just a mess right now. They brought in Hugh Jackson as a special advisor to the defense, and it seems like he hasn't made any improvements to the team, and gives the Browns a little bit more fire to want to run the ball, want to throw the ball and run up the score against their old coach that didn't seem to do them any good while he was there. So I'm definitely starting Nick Chubb this week. Duke Johnson, in PPR leagues, he has some value, but he hasn't really been the PPR back that he was last season. So I don't think Duke Johnson is a viable option. I have him as a running back 4 this week. For terms of PPR leagues and standard leagues, he has no value to me. But moving over to Joe Mixon. Joe Mixon, actually, I believe Joe Mixon's probably the only guy on the Bengals you'd want to even look at. He's been absolutely phenomenal in the games. He's been healthy this season, over 100 yards and a score in each of the last 2 games, and catching the ball out of the backfield. And without Tyler Boyd, no A.J. Green, that wide receiver core is pretty banged up. So look for Mixon to get quite a few catches out of the backfield for PPR purposes. So you're definitely going to start Joe Mixon. I have him as a top 15 play this week. Moving on to the wide receivers, we're looking at Cincinnati Bengals. Like I said, Tyler Boyd banged up, not going to play. A.J. Green out for the season. They're looking at Josh Malone's gone, so they really don't have any wide receivers. They're looking at Core, Alex Erickson. None of these guys are going to be anything. So you're going to want to sit all Bengals wide receivers. And moving on to the Browns, Jarvis Landry is a decent PPR play this week. I have him as a wide receiver too. And like I mentioned with Baker Mayfield, the Bengals are giving up quite a few fantasy points, and actually mid-range fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, although they do give a lot to opposing quarterbacks. but there's still not a very good defense there. So we're going to start Jarvis Landry. And I actually think if you're desperate, absolutely desperate, you could start Antonio Callaway this week as a low-end wide receiver 3. He has that big playability, and he did score the last time these two teams played. He had quite a good game there. So you could look at Antonio Callaway. Onto the tight ends, David Njoku. With the tight ends, I think there's kind of a tier 1 through 6 where they're must starts, and then 7 through 13 or 14 are kind of like a second tier where there's some issues there. You can kind of make a dart throw at any one of these 7 through 14 guys, and David Njoku's in that second tier range. You could start him this week if you don't have better options, but I wouldn't really rely on him. You know, he had a lot of targets last year in the red zone, and we were really high on him early in the preseason. But what ended up happening is he hasn't been the tight end that we wanted him to be. So I kind of have him as a low end option for tight end 1, high end tight end 2 this week. But if you need to start him, you absolutely can. And CJ Uzomah for the Bengals, I do not see starting. You can sit CJ Uzomah. For the defenses, actually the Browns are kind of an interesting play this week. Driscoll does actually have a tendency to turn the ball over. He does run quite a bit and makes some inaccurate throws, and not having a lot of wide receiver depth. Really, the only thing we're looking at is Joe Mixon. So I think the Browns can hold the Bengals to a low score, which could help your fantasy teams. I have the Browns as a start this week, right around 11 or 12 for defenses. You're going to sit the Bengals and probably sit both of these kickers this week. So.
Right.
All right, here we come in the Buccaneers versus Cowboys game. So Dak Prescott right off the bat, he's got a good matchup. Tampa Bay gives up the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. That bodes well for him. Now, he was held out of the end zone last week, did not score a touchdown, of course. That makes a lot of people nervous going into this game. But it was just 2 weeks ago where he played against Philadelphia. He had like an insane 400-plus yards, 3 touchdowns. He went off. And then he struggled last week, and that was against an Indianapolis Colts team that has actually been on fire, one of the hottest defenses in the NFL. And so that struggle was honestly somewhat expected, not too surprised in that. And then when we talk about Tampa Bay, like they're very bad. Not only do they give the 4th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, they actually give up the most touchdowns to quarterbacks when you consider rushing and receiving together. I don't say I'm extremely confident in Dak Prescott, but should you start him? Yeah, he's a good low-end start around that 12 to 10 range for quarterbacks. On the other side, Jameis Winston should be benched. Not only did he was awful last week, he threw for just 157 yards and an interception. He seriously struggled last week against the Ravens, but he's got another tough matchup this week against the Cowboys, who give up the 10th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, so I think that you should bench him. Of course, Ezekiel Elliott, you're going to start him. In the last 6 games, he has 4 games of over 100 yards rushing alone. He's got 3 touchdowns on the ground. Guy's going to get you 20 fantasy points almost every single game. What kind of lineup could you have? What kind of roster could you have where he doesn't crack your lineup this week? That's for sure. Then we come to Peyton Barber. You should sit Peyton Barber, guys. Dallas gives up the 9th fewest fantasy points to running backs, and he has just struggled all year. Apart from fantasy, Dallas has the 5th ranked total run defense as far as the yards go, and they're allowing just 93.4 rushing yards per game. And again, he has seriously struggled. He did score a touchdown last week, but I don't think that that's something that you can trust to happen every single week. That was in kind of a low-scoring affair. He got quite a bit of carries. As far as the wide receivers go, guys, who doesn't like Amari Cooper? Not only is the matchup good against a team that gives up the 6th most fantasy points to wide receivers, he has 30 receptions, 505 yards, and 5 TDs in the last 4 games. He is on fire. He's a guy you should absolutely start. On the other side, maybe a little less exciting, but still a guy you should start is Mike Evans. Mike Evans has 7 100 receiving yard games this season, excuse me, I'm struggling there. Anyways, but he has a little bit of decreased value in standard leagues because he only has 2 touchdowns since week 4. For whatever reason in that offense, he is struggling to find the end zone. That's been something kind of back and forth where one season he'll have 10 touchdowns and next season he'll have 3 or 4. I don't know what it seems to be the issue with him, but he is struggling to find the end zone, and that does limit him to a wide receiver 2, a wide receiver 3 range. But I still like him, and I'm hard-pressed to find rosters out there that are not going to have him in their lineup this week, at least as a wide receiver 3. Save ourselves some time. There's no Dallas tight end you're going to start. I mean, practically most of you probably don't even know any of their names. Cameron Brate is a guy you might want to look to as an option, but I'm going to caution you guys against that. He does even have a good matchup against a team that gives up the 14th most points to tight ends, but he's been brutal this year, averaging just 18 receiving yards a game. Now, he does have 3 touchdowns in the last 3 games, which is why I said, you know what, maybe you're going to want to just play him anyways because the tight end position is so thin. But last week he played the Ravens, who give up tons of fantasy points. I believe they are top 5 as far as fantasy points allowed to tight ends. He came out with just 2 targets, 1 catch, and 9 yards. He just had an awful day in an easy matchup. This matchup is far less easy, though it's still in the top half of the league. And so I don't think he's a great play, but if you're desperate, which most of us are at that position, why not? I guess you can throw him in there, but I think you should definitely stop and take a minute to look at some other options that you might have. I think you should sit both kickers. Neither of them have been great in this season. As far as the defenses go, I think that you should start the Cowboys defense. Tampa Bay gives it the 4th most points to defenses, and then you should sit Tampa Bay's D.
So what about the Vikings versus the Lions? So let's start with quarterback Kirk Cousins. So they got a new offensive coordinator, and boom, the offense scores a ton of points. So is that a sign that Kirk Cousins will get back on track now? So the first 8 weeks, he was playing really well. Through the first 8 weeks, he had 16 touchdown passes, was averaging 315 passing yards per game. Maybe they're going to get back on track. Maybe this is exactly what that offense needed. Here's the problem, though, is one of the reasons why they want to make that switch and why they got rid of their offensive coordinators. They want to simplify the playbook and get back to running the ball more effectively, which they did in this game. They ran the ball very well. The problem is running the ball more and being a more balanced attack in some ways devalues his fantasy value. It might make him a better quarterback. It might make that team overall better and that offensive better. I'm not sure that that's going to huge boost for Kirk Cousins. Now he's playing the Lions, allowing the 14th most points to quarterbacks there. When I look at Kirk Cousins in this matchup there, I think he's a guy that you can start this weekend on the road, but I think there are better, safer options out there for you. I would probably advise you to look elsewhere. Once again, he's not bad if you have to go that route, but I think you can probably come up with better matchups out there than him. As far as Matthew Stafford go, so the Vikings, last 9 quarterbacks that they have faced are averaging only 10.68 fantasy points per game. And these aren't bad quarterbacks. They have faced Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Russell Wilson. They shut Stafford down last time they faced him. They sacked him 10 times last week. They sacked Ryan Tannehill 9 times. They're leading the NFL in sacks with 47. There's a ton of reasons why you should not start Matthew Stafford. He lost Kerryon Johnson, Tate. You look at Jones. All those losses on offense have really derailed that team. And so, once again, I would stay away from Matthew Stafford. That's a bad, if you're thinking about starting him, that's a huge mistake. So as running backs go, you had Delvin Cook. So the Lions allowed the 15th most points to running back. The explosiveness that he had prior to his injury appears to be back at this point. The last 3 games, he's got 6.88 yards per carry. He's got 4 touchdowns in the last 4 games, and he's averaging 3.67 catches per game. Over 16 games, that projects out to 59 catches. There's a lot of reasons why I like him in this matchup, why I look like he's getting stronger and better. I would start him as a running back too. As far as the running backs go for Detroit, so I think there's a safe assumption that Kerryon Johnson's not going to play in this game. Why would you risk his knee in a meaningless game? I think they'd be ill-advised to play him. So let's look at LeGarrette Blount. You take away his Thanksgiving game, he's been brutal all year long. 2.8 yards per carry. My prediction is this is the last year he's going to be in the NFL. I have a feeling that LeGarrette Blount, he'll retire in the offseason. You got Zenner. So you look at Zach Zenner. He's averaged the last 2 games 11 carries per game and just under 50 yards per game. And he's also had a touchdown last 2 games. So I guess you could argue that he's some standard value, but he's facing a tough Vikings front 7. And so I would probably advise sitting Zenner in this one. And then there's Theo Riddick. You could probably argue that there's some PPR value there. He does average 4.75 catches per game, but he doesn't have a touchdown all year. And even with those 4.75 catches per game, he's only averaging 31 receiving yards per game. And so he's a guy that has a very low ceiling. I'd probably advise sitting him too if you can afford that, if you can afford to sit him. Now, before I get to wide receivers, one of the things we didn't say at the front end of the video, if there's a name here that we don't cover, I think you can safely assume to sit that guy. Okay, once again, if you have questions, put it at the bottom. But if we don't mention somebody, just assume that we're advising to sit him. As far as wide receivers go, Kenny Golladay. Last week, he was essentially the only weapon that they had there. He goes off for 7 catches, 146 yards. He looked great. He's a very talented young wide receiver. I think he's got a bright future in the NFL. But this week, he faces a tough cornerback in Xavier Rhodes. Earlier this season when he faced the Vikings and Rhodes, he went for 3 catches for 46 yards. If you're in a very, very deep league, I would say you could start him as a wide receiver 3, but in most leagues we would advise sitting him if you can afford to do that. I think the problem with him right now is just a lack of weapons there, meaning he's really the only talented wide receiver that they have there that's proven at all. And so he faces a lot of double teams and the opposing team's best cornerback. Once again, I would probably stay away from him. As far as wide receivers for the Vikings, Stephon Diggs, he's having his best season as a pro. He's closing in on 100 catches. This week he should break 1,000 yards. Playing the Lions, allowing the 10th fewest points to wide receivers. So if you look at that, they're allowing the 10th fewest points to wide receivers. They seem like they're decent. But if you actually get into the stats a little bit deeper, what you find is the Lions haven't faced many good wide receivers this year. And so I think that's part of the reason why they haven't given up a lot of points to wide receivers. I would start Stephon Diggs as a wide receiver 3. Then you have Adam Thielen. So Adam has cooled as of lately. The guy was on fire. He's cooled down quite a bit. He had his worst game of the year last game, but a lot of that was game script. They blew out the Finns, and they could run the ball at will versus them, so they just didn't need to throw the ball a lot. I think he's going to rebound this week. Start Adam as a wide receiver 1. He's a guy that you need to start weekly. As far as tight ends go, we'd advise sitting all tight ends in this game. Now, in the preseason, we said that Kyle Rudolph was overrated, is kind of the word that we use to describe him. He's been much worse than we even expected, even though we saw him as a guy that was overrated. Currently, right now, he's the 21st tight end in average points per game in PPR leagues. He's been bad. Sit him. I know that he carries that name. People are still enamored with the idea of Kyle Rudolph as a good tight end, but as far as fantasy goes, he doesn't have any value. In fact, I wouldn't even roster him at this point. I would stream somebody if you can. I would sit both kickers, start the Vikings defense, and sit the Lions defense. So, Ryan, looks like you're up for the Giants and the Colts.
Yeah, real quick, just before we get into this game, I wanted to mention that actually the Lions put Kerryon Johnson on IR today, so definitely not going to see him this week. And I know you said he probably wouldn't be playing, but he is on IR now for the rest of the season.
That's what I figured was going to happen.
Yeah, we'll look for him next year. He should be a high-ranked running back in the preseason for next year. But on to the Colts and the Giants, starting with the quarterbacks, Andrew Luck and Eli Manning. Now, these two teams actually, and as Christian mentioned, the Colts are on fire on defense. Eli Manning, Pat Shurmur has come out and said Eli Manning is his quarterback for the rest of the season. And, I mean, who knows what that really is going to do. I mean, the Giants were officially eliminated, like I mentioned before. Some of these teams that are out of it as far as playoff contention, they are officially eliminated from the playoffs last week, and they looked really bad against the Titans. Could not move the ball. Even Saquon Barkley had a down game. Odell Beckham Jr. was out. So Eli Manning's having a tough time passing the ball. He's been getting sacked quite a bit. That offensive line that they were supposed to have strengthened over the offseason really hasn't done very well. So I would actually sit Eli Manning against a very, very solid Indianapolis Colts defense. They're actually top 6 in the league for fewest fantasy points allowed to opposing quarterbacks. And surprisingly, the Giants, moving on to Andrew Luck, are top 8 in the league over the last 4 weeks to opposing quarterbacks. But you're still going to start Andrew Luck this week, mid-range quarterback 1. He's looking at the last 3 games. He hasn't been great. Actually, 2 of those games had 0 touchdowns, but the previous 8 weeks, 3 touchdowns per game. So Andrew Luck's looking for a bounce back, and actually the Colts are projected to win this game by 10 points from those stat people in the desert. So it's going to be a decent game. It's a good matchup for all Colts offensive players. So you're going to start Andrew Luck this week and sit Eli Manning. Moving on to the running backs, Marlon Mack had an absolutely ridiculous game last week, scored 25 fantasy points in my league record, 2 touchdowns. He was just running the ball all over the place, and actually the Giants are giving up the 4th most fantasy points over the last 4 weeks to opposing running backs. So Marlon Mack is probably right around the mid-range running back 2, and you're going to start Marlon Mack this week. And Nyheim Hines is kind of irrelevant at this point with Mack being able to receive the ball. The Colts used him a lot towards the beginning of the season, but that was typically when they were down in games and Mack was still kind of injured. But Mack is the only guy you're looking at from the Colts to start for running backs. Saquon Barkley, what can I say about Saquon Barkley? It doesn't matter the matchup. He might have had a down game last week, but he's on pace to do absolutely amazing things. One of the top 5 rookies of the year for offensive players. So you're definitely starting Saquon Barkley if you made it to your championship. Who could put him on the bench at this point? The Colts are actually pretty good against the run, but he catches the ball out of the backfield. Eli checks it down to him quite a bit, especially in PPR leagues. He can get anywhere from 10 to 12 catches, no problem. So you're going to start Barkley this week. You're not looking at any other running backs for the Giants. On to the wide receivers. Odell Beckham Jr. looks like he might not play this week once again. Did not suit up for practice today. We're looking at Wednesday here. So Odell Beckham, if he is out, that increases the value for Evan Ingram. But I don't really think I want to start Sterling Shepard and rely on him in my championship. If Odell is out, I'd say Sterling Shepard is a low-end wide receiver 3 in PPR. He's been having some pretty tough games, pretty tough go of it with Odell in or out this season. But if Odell does happen to play, I'd temper my expectations because of that injury. It's kind of a weird injury. Just kind of popped up on Wednesday, Thursday, and I think he'd be mid-range wide receiver 2 if Odell does happen to play. And like Christian said earlier, like we've said, that Colts defense is looking really good this year. So Odell is probably Odell and Shepard are the 2 guys you really want to look at here for the Giants. But onto the Colts, T.Y. Hilton. It's T.Y. Hilton and it's nobody else. You're going to start T.Y. Hilton against the Giants, and you're going to feel pretty good about it because this guy has the potential to go off for 200 yards and 2 touchdowns anytime he steps on the field. And he just did, he had 9 for 199 a couple of weeks ago. Kind of had a down game last week, but that was all game script. The Colts were up on the Cowboys, and they just ran the ball. So you're going to start T.Y. Hilton this week. As far as tight ends go, the Giants, like I said, if Odell is out, Evan Ingram seems to have much better games. He had 8 for 75 last week. I think it was 6 for 80 the week before. So that's the 2 games without Odell. When Odell is on the field, the targets don't seem to go Ingram's way. So if Odell is out, Evan Ingram's more the back end. He's in that second tier of tight ends that I was talking about, right around the 8 to 10 range for him. And Eric Ebron is a definite starter. He might have had a down game last week, but still he's having the best season of his career. So you're looking at starting Evan Ingram against the Giants this week. For defenses, we're not starting the Giants defense. We are definitely starting the Colts defense against the Giants. They could potentially shut them out. Giants got shut out last week, and the Colts shut out the Cowboys. So it's definitely an option again that could happen. So you want to start the Colts defense. And for kickers, it is an indoor game. So I feel pretty good about Vinatieri this week. I would start Vinatieri if you have him on your team. Rosas had no points last week, obviously, with the team getting shut out, but he has been a solid kicker this year. So if the Giants are able to move the ball and they get in range, he will be able to boot it. So if you have Rosas on your team, I feel pretty comfortable starting him as well.
All right, now we come to the Jaguars versus the Dolphins. Before I get into this, I just need to say that I did the research for this game at about 1 in the morning last night, and I just wanted to hit my head against a wall. It was so boring. I'll be honest, there's not a lot of fantasy value in this game, that's for sure. Speaking of not a lot of fantasy value, let's talk about the quarterbacks. Cody Kessler, man, he was awful last week. He had 17 attempts, completed 9 of them for just 57 yards, no scores, and an interception. In fact, his play was so bad, reports are coming out that Blake Bortles could get his job back this week. I don't know if I need to say any more. How about we don't start them this week? That is just awful. On the other side, we look at Ryan Tannehill. Now, I actually like Tannehill. He has played well. He doesn't have a lot of weapons, so he does scare me. And Jacksonville's a good defense. It should be a low-scoring game. The Jags give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks, which means, honestly, all in all, I'm not starting Ryan Tannehill unless it's a 2-quarterback league, a 16-team league. You're desperate, right? So I don't think he should crack a lot of lineups unless you're desperate. But I do want to talk about, he's had some good games. In fact, over the last 4 weeks, he went out and he had 8 touchdowns. Now, he struggled last week against Minnesota's defense and didn't do anything. But we talked about how good they are, allowing just, 10 fantasy points to Breeze and Brady and Wilson, some elite quarterbacks, and I do not use that term elite lightly at all. Then you give this guy no weapons, put him up against that defense, he struggles. But other than that, the other 3 weeks, he had 2 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns, 3 touchdowns. I do like him as a quarterback, but he doesn't have enough options for me to really buy into or be excited about his fantasy value, especially in a championship week. As far as the running backs go, it's kind of a similar situation to the quarterbacks in that, or at least a similar situation to Ryan Tannehill, where it's just, I'm not excited but you may have to start him. We look at Leonard Fournette. He has been banged up with a foot injury and has only had 82 rushing yards combined in the last 2 weeks. He has struggled. However, he's got a good matchup against the Dolphins, who give up the 6th most fantasy points to running backs. This is going to be a low-scoring affair, and I think he's just going to keep getting that rock. He's just going to keep pounding the ball. I think that you should have low expectations for him, but he should still, especially in standard leagues, be played as a running back too, in that sort of situation. Again, not exciting, but sometimes you just got to put a guy out there and understand that he's got a high floor based on carries, really. Now we come to the other running backs for the Dolphins, and this Drake Ballage situation is interesting. So Frank Gore is injured. He is out of the picture. We thought a lot of people expect, that's going to clear things up and that, Drake will be the guy who's going to get the ball. Well, reports are coming out that he's actually going to maintain his role as the change of pace back and that they don't want to actually do anything new with him. They want to kind of keep things similar to the way that it has been. Now, Ballage gets this new role, and he explodes last week. He has like 125 yards and a touchdown. He looks pretty good against a tough Vikings defense. So should you play him this week? Well, the answer is no. For one thing, we really don't have enough time to trust him. For two, he's still splitting with Kenyon Drake. And then three, you have to understand that if you take away one lucky 75-yard touchdown, he had just 47 yards on 11 carries for no scores. That's not bad, but that's not impressive enough for you to put him on your fantasy championship roster. And so I think that you should sit Ballage this week simply because there are too many question marks. There's a high ceiling. If you're desperate, if you still have a question like, hey, I might need to play him this week, ask us. We'll talk about it. We'll look at your options, but I'm not excited about him. We go now to the wide receivers. D.D. Westbrook is probably the best receiver for Jacksonville. Not excited about him. Don't think that you should play him. He does have 2 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. That quarterback situation is such a mess that I really think you should avoid him. However, in the last 4 weeks, he has had 3 good games. One, he scored 16 fantasy points. One, he scored 18. And one, he scored 11. So maybe as a wide receiver 3, if you're desperate, if you're looking to fill in, maybe, for example, for Odell Beckham Jr., who might not play this week or whatever. And then the other side, really the best wide receiver for the Dolphins is Kenny Stills. Kenny Stills just caught 1 pass last week. He only caught a single pass. And you know what? It's not going to get any better this week when he goes up against one of the best corners in the NFL in Jalen Ramsey. So I think that you should sit him. And unfortunately, can't believe I'm saying this, Kenny Stills was the best wide receiver for the Dolphins at this point. So I think you should avoid all of them. Honestly, this is not going to be a very great matchup. In fact, Jacksonville gives up the fewest fantasy points to wide receivers. I did get to save myself some time in my research. I mean, I still research to be thorough and to be safe, but save some time in the video. I don't have a lot to say as far as the tight ends. You should sit Jacksonville tight ends. You should sit Dolphins tight ends. You should sit the Jags kickers, the Dolphins kickers, and honestly, I think you should sit both defenses. I think that there's certainly an opportunity for some of these players to step up because there isn't a lot of great options in this game. But opportunity is not what we're looking for in a championship game. Maybe the Jacksonville defense beats up on the Dolphins offense and has a huge fantasy day, but can you trust them to? No, I don't think that you can trust them to. And so there's some high upside in some of these players in these games, but definitely makes me nervous.
Let's talk about the Bills and the Patriots. Start with quarterback Josh Allen versus New England, allowing the 12th most points to quarterbacks. Now, last 4 weeks since returning from an injury, he's averaged 26.28 fantasy points per game. Since the team has released Kelvin Benjamin, it's really opened up opportunities for Zay Jones and Robert Foster, and Foster's really blossomed in that role. We'll get to him in a little bit there. Now, if you talk about quarterbacks this year that are athletic and run the ball, you think about Lamar Jackson, but Josh Allen might be the best of them in terms of his production right now. This season's got 6 rushing touchdowns. He's had games where he had 101, 135, and 99 rushing yards. So this guy's been very effective running the ball. Now, last Sunday, the Bills actually ran out of running backs. They all got injured. They had nobody left. Obviously, they're going to roster a running back this week. Undoubtedly, they're going to have somebody out there, but they don't have a lot of depth. And so I think that bodes well for the fact that he's still going to be used running the ball. There'll be quarterback keepers, quarterback sneaks, goal line carries, things like that. So that keeps him relevant there. He's going to get those carries. When you look at Lamar Jackson versus Josh Allen, I actually prefer Josh Allen this week. I like him. I don't think he's a bad play. There is risk there because that offense is not dynamic, doesn't have a lot of weapons. He is a rookie. But I think in this matchup, in a game that I assume that they're going to be playing from behind, I don't mind Josh Allen if you are desperate or, like you said, Christian, in a 2-quarterback league where you have to start him. You got Tom Brady versus the Bills. The Bills give the fewest points to quarterbacks. So after exploding 2 weeks ago, last weekend, he was really what I would call pedestrian. I think that Tom Brady is still a quality quarterback, but in this matchup, I would sit him. As far as running backs go, it's Sony Michel. The Bills allow the 11th most points to running backs. He's battled knee injuries this year, and the fact that New England likes to spread the ball out, spread their touches out. But he's still having a nice season. 4.3 yards per carry. He's got 765 rushing yards, 5 touchdowns. Now, in 2 of the last 3 games he faced, Pittsburgh and Minnesota, both are in the top 10 in terms of their ability to shut down the run and points allowed to running backs there. They're very good defenses against the run. But if you look at the Bills, on the other hand, the Bills can be exploited against the run there. So I actually like Sony Michel this week as a running back too. I think he's going to have a decent game. I wouldn't be surprised to see him getting maybe 80 yards and a touchdown there. So not a great play, but I think he's a fair play. Then you have James White. James White's value is really in PPR league scoring. His catches have decreased slightly the last 4 games, but he still has 81 catches for the season. Those are great numbers. Currently, he's the 10th running back in PPR league scoring. He's having a phenomenal year there. So I would say in smaller leagues, he's a running back 2 start. If you're in a larger league, he's a running back 1 start in PPR leagues. Obviously, he loses quite a bit of value in standards. So who do you run out there for the Bills? Sounds like everybody that's run the ball for them is injured, on the IR, beat up. I don't trust any of the running backs anyways outside of LaShawn McCoy, who is dealing with a hamstring injury. We don't know if he's going to play this week or not. We'll have to watch injury report, see how he progresses there. If he can play, he's a low-end running back 3 or flex play against New England, allowing the 16th fewest points to running backs, but even there he carries certain risk. As far as wide receivers go, you have Robert Foster. So New England allows the 13th fewest points to wide receivers. He's a first-year player. I want to talk about him just briefly here because for some of you may not know who this guy is. 6'2", 195-pound Pennsylvania native. He ran a 40 that was really fast playing for the Crimson Tide. It was 4.34. He was very fast there. A lot of people that covered him, a lot of people at Alabama there would talk about just how he's got rare speed was the description that they used. One of the coaches described him as a freakish athlete. They went on to say that there are some things he's going to do in the combine and when he gets to the NFL that are going to make people question why this guy wasn't a top 5 or 6 pick. So leading out of college, this guy definitely had a lot of positive things there. The reason why we share that, the reason why I talk about him just briefly is I don't think the success that he's having is a fluke necessarily. I think this guy can legitimately be a very good wide receiver in the NFL. For the last 5 games, he's averaged 103 receiving yards per game. Let me say that again. 4 of the last 5 games, he's averaging 103 receiving yards per game. That's very solid there. If you look at his speed, Josh Allen's arm strength and the fact that he can scramble, that's a perfect combination there. I think they're a great fit together. I actually like him. Now, if I look at this game, I assume the Bills are going to be playing from behind and need to throw the ball quite a bit there. So I would say he's a wide receiver 3 start this week. As far as Julian Edelman goes, Bills allow the 6 fewest points to wide receivers. He's not a huge touchdown guy, and his yardage totals are not great per se. But he gets a lot of targets and gets a lot of catches, and that gives him a solid PPR value. He's a wide receiver 2 in PPR leagues. I'd say he's a wide receiver 4 in standards. Then there's Josh Gordon. So coming to New England really, I think, solidified his floor, but it really lowered his ceiling. Now, he had a disappointing game last game against Pittsburgh, going 1 for 19, not very good there. I think he's going to rebound this week for maybe 4 catches, 75 yards. So for me, that's kind of a bubble wide receiver 3 or 4 play, but he's going to have cornerback White that he's going to face, and that's going to be a tough matchup for him there. And so I think Josh Gordon could be a decent play, but I don't think he's a great play. He's probably closer for me to a wide receiver 4. I would lean towards sitting him if you can afford to do that. Sit the Bills tight ends. Then you got Rob Gronkowski. The tight end position is thin, so if you have Rob Gronkowski, you got to start this guy. With that said, I've been watching him this year, and he looks like he's a step slower. He just doesn't look like the old Gronkowski. In fact, an analyst this week described him as stiff and slow. And that's kind of after I heard that description, after watching him play, I would agree. There's something about him that looks like he's just not quite there. With that said, the position is so thin that you're going to have to start Rob Gronkowski. It'd be a major mistake for you not to start him. Stephen Gostkowski, a stable at the position for many years, has been a liability this season. I would sit him. I'd also sit Stephen Hauschka. And I would start New England's defense. Right now, the Bills are allowing the most points to quarterbacks, and I would sit the Bills defense. Packers and the Jets. You're up, Ryan.
All right, Green Bay Packers. We're looking at Aaron Rodgers now. Earlier this week, the coach for the Packers came out and said that he doesn't have any plans to rest any of his players. You know, they're all getting paid on these contracts, so, you know, Aaron Rodgers is getting over $2 million per game. They're not just going to bench him, but he did come out of the game last week for a minute. He was injured on the field, and he really honestly hasn't been that great for fantasy purposes over the last 4 weeks. 17.5 points per game over the last 4 weeks, only 4 touchdowns over the last 4 weeks. He did have that 2-point conversion last week, but he just hasn't been great this season. Part of that could be the offense. Part of that could be just the injury that he suffered early in the season, just lingering. But I have actually Aaron Rodgers against the Jets this week, giving up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks in the last 4 weeks. I have Aaron Rodgers as a top 10 play. He's still going to be a starter. It's going to be a difficult time to put him on your bench, so you're going to want to start Aaron Rodgers, but I would lower expectations just because of the way that offense has been running over the past 4 or 5 weeks or so. But definitely start Aaron Rodgers. Sam Darnold for the Jets. Packers giving up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Darnold has actually looked pretty good. He had 273 yards and 2 touchdowns last week, and over 20 fantasy points with the 35 rushing yards. But I wouldn't put the weight of your fantasy championship on Sam Darnold, a rookie quarterback. He is having a decent year, showed that he was definitely a good choice as a top 3 draft pick. But Sam Darnold, you're probably going to want to bench him this week. There's got to be better options out there for your fantasy teams. As far as running backs go, Aaron Jones out for the Packers. Jamal Williams is going to get the start, and there's really nobody else at this point for the Packers. So Jamal Williams actually in his time as a starter has looked pretty good this season. He's running well, had 16 touches last week, and that was after basically the first quarter was over when Aaron Jones went down. So look for Jamal Williams to get probably 20 touches this week. Surprisingly, over the last 4 weeks, the Jets are giving up the fewest fantasy points to opposing running backs at only 15.2. But when it comes down to it, you're going to want to start Jamal Williams as a back-end RB2 this week, and he's going to be the only guy. He's going to get all the work for the Packers, and potentially if they're up in this game, he could get a lot more work. But there's no other Packers running backs. Elijah McGuire for the Jets, he looks like he's going to be the guy as well. They put Isaiah Crowell on IR. They had Bilal Powell go down on IR, and Trenton Cannon is more the change of pace, the passing down back, it seems like. Elijah McGuire does have the ability to catch balls out of the backfield. The Packers are middle of the road fantasy defense as far as opposing running backs go. They're ranked 17th over the last 4 weeks. But you're going to want to start Elijah McGuire. He had a down game last week, but that was against a really stout Houston Texans defense. McGuire is going to get a ton of work against the Packers at home, and he can catch the balls out of the passing game. I would put him as a very low-end RB2, but he's going to get a lot of work there. So he's the only guy we'd be looking at. For the wide receiver position, start Devontae Adams. Jets giving up the most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers in the last 4 weeks, over 43 points a game. You're going to start Devontae Adams. Really nobody else to worry about. Randall Cobb came out of the game last week with a concussion, so we're not looking at him. Geronimo Allison's gone, so really it's Devontae Adams and nobody else for the Packers at this point. And for the Jets, it's Robbie Anderson, and that's all we're going to be looking at. Had an amazing game last week. Did catch the touchdown. Put up 22 fantasy points in PPR leagues. So Robbie Anderson we're looking at as probably a low-end wide receiver 2, high-end wide receiver 3. And that's surprising to say after the down start that he had this season. But he seems to be the number 1 target for Darnold right now. And he has been coming on as of late, especially the last 2 weeks. He could be a league winner in the last 3 weeks of the season for your fantasy matchups. Tight end position, Jimmy Graham, you're going to bench because he's been Jimmy Graham this year. That Packers tight end position has not been good. We talked about it in the preseason, and I actually have him as not even a starter in a 16-team league this week. And the Jets give up very low numbers. I believe it's bottom 8 numbers against opposing tight ends, so you're not going to start Jimmy Graham this week. And then on to the Jets. Chris Herndon looks like it's going to be the guy for the tight end, but you're not going to start him. He's in the 15 to 16 range for tight ends. So as far as defenses go, I wouldn't start either of these defenses. The game is indoors. Well, not really indoors, but it is at MetLife, which is kind of a open stadium. But I would actually start Mason Crosby this week, and you can start Justin Myers for the Jets. So that's the case with the Packers and Jets.
All right, here we go in the Texans versus the Eagles. Now, first, I don't know why, but I'm excited to watch this game. I'm excited to watch Deshaun Watson, and Watson has been playing well. Last week, he had a near-perfect quarterback rating of 134.2, and I think part of that was due to the fact that Lamar Miller got hurt and really forced Deshaun Watson to be a bit more of the Deshaun Watson we saw last year. Last year, he was just on fire. They asked him to do so much. He had insane fantasy value. And then this year, his numbers weren't quite the same because they're just asking him to be more efficient, to, be a smarter passer, not turn the ball over, be a bit more conservative. And then the running game kind of goes away, and we see a bit more of what he did last year. And that was a lot of fun to watch. I think he's a must start this week because he goes against the Eagles, who give up the 11th most fantasy points to quarterbacks and are actually the 31st ranked pass defense in the NFL. I think that's a match made in heaven. Watson should have a good week. Nick Foles is a guy you should sit. The Texans give up the 14th fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. Now, as far as the running backs go, I don't know if I've ever seen a game with such a mess of running backs on both sides. I don't think that you should start or try to trust anyone in the Texans running back sort of field. Lamar Miller is questionable. He may or may not play. Honestly, who knows? I think, of course, they're going to try to play him as soon as he's ready, but they don't know if he's going to be ready. Donta Foreman, he's a running back who at the beginning of this year people thought he might be the starter. Then he got hurt. He might be back. Or he might not. No one's really sure. Alfred Blue's going to play, but his carries depend entirely on those other two guys and whether or not they play and how much they play and how healthy they are. And it's just like a mix of three guys that we're just not sure how many carries each of them are going to get. And at this point, that is not a situation that you should trust or lean on at all. Now, if reports come out, oh, hey, look, Lamar Miller's actually doing great. He's definitely going to play. He's 100% healthy. And maybe he can work his way into a running back 2 role if you don't have any fantastic options. But I doubt that's going to be the case. I think it's going to be iffy, one of those game time decisions kind of going throughout the whole week. On the other side, we have a very, very similar situation there in Philadelphia that's just not great. To get Wendell Smallwood, Josh Adams, and Darren Sproles. Now, it's insane to me how many running backs the Eagles have gone through this year because they started the year with Jay Ajayi supposed to be the guy. And then it was Corey Clement, and then Josh Adams kind of took off. But then Darren Sproles came back, and now Wendell Smallwood had a huge game last game. It's very confusing. In fact, Smallwood scored twice last game, but he only carried the ball 4 times in the previous 5 games. So despite exploding last game, can you trust Smallwood? Not really. In his last 6 games, only one of those games have really been productive. And then, of course, Darren Sproles takes a little bit up, but you can't trust him. Josh Adams was doing good, but now he's losing his role. To make matters worse, they play the Texans, who give up the 8th fewest fantasy points to running backs and give up just 88.3 rushing yards per game. So you should sit all running backs in this game. It's just a mess right now. As far as the wide receivers go, I like Alshon Jeffrey. Since Nick Foles took over the last game, he performed well. He had 160 receiving yards on 8 targets with 8 catches. For whatever reason, Nick Foles likes to throw Alshon Jeffrey's way. He's the number 1 wide receiver in that offense. I think he's a wide receiver 2 play this week that I like. The other wide receiver in that offense is Golden Tate. And Tate has had at least 5 targets in 4 of the last 5 games. However, he is behind Zach Ertz and Alshon Jeffrey on the list of guys to target. And so I think that at best he becomes a low-end wide receiver 3 in PPR leagues, but nothing really more than that. And I'm probably going to bench him in any standard leagues that I'm in. Guys, you made it to the championship. Congratulations. I don't need to tell you to start DeAndre Hopkins in a matchup against a team that gives the 2nd most points to wide receivers. So let's save some time there and just move on. As far as the other wide receivers for the Texans go, Kiki Kuti has not played in the last 3 weeks, which means he cannot be trusted to go into this week. And then there's Demaryius Thomas. Well, he's going to be playing, but can you trust him? No, I don't think that you can trust him either, because if Kiki does play, then Thomas has no value. And even when he doesn't, Thomas has been just okay. They do have a slightly tough matchup again against this Houston Texans defense that's actually played pretty good this week, and so really the only wide receiver in there that I trust is Hopkins, and I certainly trust him with 100%. As far as the tight ends go, you're going to start Zach Ertz. He's got a good matchup against a team that gives up the 6th most fantasy points to tight ends. Though he has been held under 100 yards in 5 straight games. The Texans do allow 258 passing yards per game. That's 26th in the NFL, so that does bode well for sure. You should sit Jordan Thomas. He's got a tough matchup. He only had 1 reception on 1 target for 7 yards last week. You should start both tight ends. These are 2 very good tight ends. Jake Elliott is playing very well. He had a
Kickers, of course.
Kickers, excuse me.
Yeah.
Same thing, right? Whatever. It's the same. Nobody cares about kickers, right?
They're going to score the same.
At this point, anyways, excuse me. Last week he had 3 field goals and 3 extra points. He kicked very, very well. And you got to start this guy. He's one of the best kickers in the league. And you also have to start Fairbairn. He's got a great match against the Eagles to give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers. On top of that, he made 5 field goals last week. That's the 2nd time that he has done that in the last 3 games. You got to start both these kickers, man. It's crazy. As far as the defenses go, you should sit the Eagles and you should start the Texans.
Talk about the Falcons and the Panthers. Start with Matt Ryan. See, the Panthers allow the 8th most points to quarterbacks there. He's having the 2nd best season of his career. His quarterback rating of 107 is very good. He's got 30 touchdown passes already, and he's averaging over 300 passing yards per game there. I think a lot of that due to the regression of the Falcons defense. Falcons defense is not good. They lost some guys early in the year due to injury. They're at 29th in the NFL right now, allowing 27.2 points per game. That forces him to have to throw the ball quite a bit there. A lot of places, sites I look at this week have him ranked about the 12th range for quarterbacks. I actually have him top 5 or 6. I like Matt Ryan in this matchup quite a bit there. I think he's a great play. As far as Cam Newton goes, he's got a shoulder injury that really looks like he's gotten the best of him. In fact, if you look at Monday's game, he didn't attempt a throw past 20 yards in the entire game on Monday. And so I know he's been battling through a shoulder injury, and you could see it. He's just not effective. He's not the same quarterback there. The last 3 games, he's not been good. In the last 3 games, he's got 2 touchdown passes to 6 interceptions. And 2 of those defenses, Tampa Bay and the Browns, are not good defenses, and he struggled versus them. Now, he does play Atlanta, giving up the 2nd most points to quarterbacks. Now, the first time he faced him, he had a very good game. He had 335 passing yards and 3 touchdown passes, but a lot has changed since, including the injury that we had previously mentioned, and he's struggling right now. I suspect in this game he's going to rebound a little bit. I expect about 250 yards, 2 touchdown passes, and an interception. Maybe as a bonus, he'll have a rushing touchdown. With that said, though, I think he carries a ton of red flags going into this one because of his shoulder injury and the struggles that he's had. Start if you need to, but I hope that you can look elsewhere in this one as far as Cam Newton goes. As far as running backs go, there's Christian McCaffrey playing the Panthers, giving up the 3rd most points to running backs. He's having a phenomenal year. Just start that stud running back. And then you got Tevin Coleman. He's had a boomer bust season where he's had some games he's been great, and he had back-to-back games where he was brutal. But now Ito Smith is on IR, so you don't have to worry about the hot hand scenario where they're going to play the hot hand. It's not a running back by committee. He's going to get a bulk of the carries, which now I think you can trust Tevin Coleman in this one. He has a tougher matchup versus Carolina, giving up the 7th fewest points to running backs. Earlier this season when Coleman faced them, he had a big game. He had 16 carries, 107 yards. But even if he struggles running the ball in this game there, he's very active in the passing game, and he's a great volume play as he's going to get a majority of the carries in this game. As far as wide receivers go, you got Julio Jones. Panthers give up the 2nd most points to wide receivers. He's having a great season as usual. Early in the year, he had struggled to find the end zone, but he's changed that as of late. 6 touchdowns in the last 7 games. Bad news, the last game, he suffered a rib injury, and he was barely used in the second half of that game. All indications are, though, that he's going to play in this one, and you'd be foolish not to start him, even if he does have a rib injury. Are you going to really sit Julio Jones? Probably not. You're going to play him. They have Calvin Ridley. Guy's shown some potential this year, but he's really a guy's got a bright future, but has been touchdown dependent all year long. It's really hard to trust him in this game at this point. It's your Week 16 championship. He's a wide receiver 4. You could start him as a wide receiver 3 in larger leagues. If Jones is less than 100%, maybe you could bump him to wide receiver 2 value, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. As far as Curtis Samuel and DJ Moore go, with Cam struggling with his shoulder injury there, that really devalues both wide receivers. He's been making shorter throws, and what we're seeing with Cam there is those shorter throws means that McCaffrey and Ian Thomas, the tight end, are really the benefactors of those shorter throws and the targets there, and they steal away targets from these wide receivers. So I think Moore is a wide receiver 4 and Samuel is a wide receiver 5. I'd probably stay away from both of these guys right now. I just don't trust Cam Newton. That shoulder of the offense, a lot of issues there, so I would probably avoid them if you can. As far as tight ends go, you have Ian Thomas. Atlanta gives up the 14 fewest points to tight ends. He was quiet last week versus the Saints, but going into that matchup, the Saints had allowed the second fewest points to tight ends. And so that was a tough matchup. Predictably, he didn't do very good. I think he's going to rebound this week, and I think he's a tight end that you could start if you don't have a stud tight end to start in his place. If you're desperate and you've been streaming tight ends, he's a guy that's got some sleeper appeal there. If you're in daily fantasy, I think he's a guy that you could play for very cheap. You have Austin Hooper. Carolina gives up the fourth most points to tight ends. Earlier this season when Hooper faced them, he went 5 catches, 59 yards, and a touchdown. He's been very predictable all year long. In good matchups, he does well, and in bad matchups, he struggles. This is a good matchup. I think Austin Hooper is a fair tight end play. I think you can trust him to have a decent game. He's got a safe floor, but a lower ceiling because of his skill level. I would start Bryant. I would sit Catanzaro, the kickers, and I would sit both defenses in this one. Here we go with the Rams and the Cardinals.
Yeah, the Rams and the Cardinals. This is a pretty easy matchup to go through here. Jared Goff playing against the Cardinals. Now, he had a down game last week against the Philadelphia Eagles defense, which should have been a good matchup for him. And Arizona giving up the most fantasy points to opposing running backs, and it should be a pretty easy game for the Rams. I don't think that Goff is going to have a lot of volume, but I think that his opportunity and his completion percentage is still going to be good enough to where he's going to be able to they're going to be able to move the ball, and he's going to have opportunities to throw the ball into the end zone. So I have Jared Goff as a top 12 play this week. You're going to start him, but you might want to lower expectations, like I said, because they are going to be able to move the ball so well and run the ball against the Arizona Cardinals that he's not like a top 5 quarterback like he has been in a lot of games this season, but he's definitely still a starter for you. Josh Rosen for the Arizona Cardinals. The Rams are actually giving up only 14 points to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks, which is very, very low. And Rosen actually got pulled in the last game against the Falcons, I believe it was it Glennon that came in, if I remember correctly? Yep. We don't really know what's going on with the Cardinals. They moved to a new offensive coordinator. Things are supposed to be looking up for them, and they just had a very bad game against the Falcons, who was actually supposed to be a good defensive matchup for the Cardinals, but it was difficult. And now with the Rams getting Akeem Talib back, Peters has been not horrible over the last 3 weeks, so I don't think that anybody's going to be starting Josh Rosen or Mike Glennon on their fantasy teams, especially in the championship. He's lost a lot of his options this season, and we're not starting him, but we're going to start Jared Goff. Running back situation for the Rams is kind of interesting. Todd Gurley on Monday morning said he had a bunch of swelling in his knee last 3 or 4 games. His carries have been lower because of that issue with his knee. Now, the Rams did sign C.J. Anderson this week, and we know Malcolm Brown went on IR. They do have Justin Davis there. They gave John Kelly some run. He looked good in the preseason. So I would definitely start Todd Gurley. With that knee issue, I lower him down to running back 4 this week. If he for sure was going to go 100%, he'd be running back number 1. But I have a slight suspicion that the Rams think that they can win this matchup and pretty handily. So there's a chance that Todd Gurley may get limited snaps, maybe doesn't play in the second half if they're up by 2 or 3 touchdowns. So you're going to start Gurley, but you want to watch those expectations. Definitely watch the practice reports for the rest of the week and see if he is going to be a go. And especially with them signing C.J. Anderson. But if Gurley does not play, I would expect C.J. Anderson and John Kelly to carry the load. So you want to take a look at that, but I don't really know that you can rely on them in your fantasy championship. For the Arizona Cardinals, it's David Johnson and nobody else. They're going to run David Johnson out there. The Rams giving up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing running backs over the last 4 weeks. David Johnson catches the ball out of the backfield. All the offense basically goes through him. And he has had some up and down games, but still top 12 fantasy running back throughout the season, in PPR leagues. So you're going to start David Johnson for sure. As far as wide receivers go, Larry Fitzgerald is basically the only guy you want to look at for the Arizona Cardinals, but he's still a low-end wide receiver 3. He's going to see some Talib, he's going to see some Peters, and it's going to be a difficult matchup, and Rosen hasn't been able to get the ball out very, very well to the wide receivers this last couple of weeks. For the Rams, Brandon Cooks and Robert Robert Woods are both wide receiver 2 options. And like I said, depending on volume, Jared Goff is still going to have some options. They should be able to move the ball, get it in the red zone, and they could see some red zone time there. But I would say Woods and Cooks should be wide receiver 2. Cooks had a great game, 7 for 150 against the Cardinals in their first matchup, so that's a good matchup for him. And that's all we're looking at for wide receivers. I would sit both of these tight ends. Actually, these teams give up very few fantasy points to opposing tight ends, and the 2 tight ends in the game are not very good to begin with. Gerald Everett came on for a couple of weeks, but he's kind of quieted back down. And Ricky Seals-Jones, we had high expectations for at the beginning of the year, but he has not really been a viable fantasy option, even in 16-team leagues. So we're going to sit both of these tight ends here. You can start the Rams defense against the Cardinals. That offense is poor right now, to say the least, and bench the Cardinals. And for kickers, we're going to obviously start Greg Zuerlein, and we're going to bench the Arizona Cardinals kicker.
All right, now we have the Bears and the 49ers. So we're looking at Mitchell Trubisky right off the bat, and he is a low-end quarterback play, right? Maybe a quarterback 12, or if you're in a 16-team league, he finds a roster or 2-quarterback league, right? Something like that. Now, when you look at it, he's had 235 or less passing yards in 8 games this season. So he hasn't been fantastic, but he really is honestly kind of a product of that offense and that defense and just that team system all around, where they're just not asking him to do too much, where they're saying, we don't need you to go out there and win a game for us. We just need to make sure you don't go out there and lose a game for us. 49ers are a great matchup this week as they give up the 6th most fantasy points to quarterbacks. And what I really like is they've actually given up 30 passing touchdowns this season. That's 2nd most in the NFL. So I think that is a great matchup right there. Mitchell Trubisky, not a great quarterback, but a great matchup. Nick Mullins should not be played this week. The Bears have given up just a single passing touchdown in the last 4 weeks. In fact, the 2nd fewest fantasy points to quarterbacks. Jordan Howard is a guy who's been a disappointment this year at running back, but I actually think he's a pretty good play. He's got 16 carries in 3 straight games and 4 of the last 5. That is very impressive. On top of that, the 49ers give up 112.1 rushing yards per game. They have allowed a running back to score in every game since their Week 11 bye, so I think that Jordan Howard could really capitalize on that and be a good running back to start in standard leagues. Now, Tariq Cohen is kind of the opposite story, where I don't think that you should play him for the same reason, which is matchup. Despite the fact they give a lot to running backs, they don't give a lot up to passing to running backs. Cohen, while he has had 10 catches in each of the Bears' last 6 games, 49ers have not allowed a running back to have over 45 receiving yards since Week 4, which means I think they're going to be very limited. He's going to be very limited in that role. Now we go to the 49ers running back situation. Make this one pretty quick. Matt Breida and Jeff Wilson. What's going on there, man? They're splitting a lot of time simply because I think Matt Breida is the guy, but he's banged up, and so they need to keep Jeff Wilson in there enough to keep him healthy, right? And just because there's only so much of that workload that he can take. For that reason, and the fact that the Bears give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to running backs, I don't think that you should play either of these guys this week. I think that's a pretty simple argument, but that's really just the way that it is. If Matt Breida were healthy, I'd say play him, but really, when is Matt Breida ever healthy? So that's a bit of a problem for him. Now, we really like wide receiver Dante Pettis. If you're looking for a wide receiver 3 or a flex play this week, he's got a pretty good setup. Now, the Bears, again, we talked about how good of a defense they are, but they do give up the 13th most fantasy points to wide receivers. And Pettis has really worked his way into the #1 role in that offense, as we've talked countless times over the last few weeks. He's got 4 touchdowns in the last 4 weeks. We were talking about this last night, Rob. We were talking about that Bears wide receivers, making this short and simple. You should sit all of them. I remember saying, I don't know an interesting way to say that none of them have been producing. That's what I told you last night, and I did some research, and you know what? They just haven't been. You can look at the numbers if you want, look at the game logs if you want. It's just been awful. I mean, the guy that we thought was starting to emerge, Anthony Miller, and starting to work his way into that role and be that #1 wideout, he was really getting up there. He had over 125 yards and a touchdown 1 week, and then boom, he just disappeared. 2 weeks, the last 2 weeks, he's combined for just 1 target. Like, that's awful. The production is just not there. course, George Kittle, we talked about at the beginning of the year how much we like this guy and how great of a season he could be, or he could have, and how good he could be. Well, he far surpassed that, especially when you can look at his quarterback situation. He's had over 1,100 receiving yards this season. He's been extremely impressive. You should play for certain George Kittle. You should sit Trey Burton. His production actually hasn't been great. 49ers have not allowed a tight end to top 46 receiving yards since Week 6. And although he's had 12 targets combined in the last 2 games since Mitchell Trubisky's return, he's really only added that up for 58 yards, and so that's just production hasn't been great. However, the tight end position is so thin. I know a lot of you people are going to be leaving a comment saying, should I start him anyways? Well, that of course depends on what your other options are, so just get down in the comment section below and we'll talk it out for sure. You should sit both kickers, Cody Parquet and Robbie Gould. You should sit the 49ers defense. And of course, start the Bears defense. They're a great start this week against that 49ers offense.
So my last game here, the Steelers versus the Saints. This is a game I look forward to watching. I think it's going to be a good game there. The quarterback, Ben Roethlisberger, versus the hottest defense in the NFL. Last 6 games, the Saints defense has been very, very good. Now, stats would seem to indicate that the Saints give up these 6 most points to quarterbacks, but a lot of that was some early season struggles that they had. Recently, they've actually played quite a bit better, and so that number can be a little deceiving there. Now, if you look at Ben, he was hot for a while there. He's cooled off a bit as of late. Now, I think that's coincided with the fact that James Conner's been out. Maybe play action is not effective. Maybe defenses are not respecting the run. Although with the huge game that Samuels had last game, if Conner's not able to return and play this one, I think that big game was going to go a long way in terms of keeping defenses more honest, and play action might help there. With that said, even though that defense for the Saints is playing better, even though Ben Roethlisberger has struggled as of late, he is still right now the 5th quarterback as far as average points per game. In fact, it's funny, in the preseason we had him ranked number 5. And a lot of sites had him around 12 to 14 area there. And right now he's the 5th quarterback in average points per game there. He's got too many good weapons around him. He's too good to sit at this point. So I would play Ben Roethlisberger in this one. So you got Drew Brees. Steelers allowed the 10th most points to quarterbacks. He had a record-setting start, but the last 3 games he's disappointed. In fact, he hurt me in a game that I really needed him to produce this week, and that's why I'm playing for 3rd place, not championship, because Drew Brees struggled. With that said, in every season, no matter how good of a season you have, there are going to be ebbs and flows. This guy's still having a very amazing season. You need to start him in this matchup there. I think if anything hurts Drew Brees, it's the fact that Saints defense is playing well and he doesn't need to do as much as he had earlier in the year. With that said, I think the Steelers offense will move the ball, score some points, and force that offense to have to respond and score points there. I think that's going to drive up the over-under in this game, so I would start Drew Brees. As far as running backs go, I got Jalen Samuels and James Conner. Conner is expected to return this week from a high ankle sprain, so everything would seem to indicate that he's going to return. We'll have to watch and see how his practice progresses. With that said, I actually own both of these guys, and I'm playing some championship weeks there. I'm hoping that James Conner sits one more week, and here's why. Samuels played so well last game that even if Conner comes back, I think that Samuel's going to steal touches from him. I hate that. So I'd rather have Conner sit and just know that Jalen Samuels will be the go-to guy there. If James Conner does come back, knowing the fact that Samuels is going to get some of those touches now, I think he's a mid-range running back 2, whereas earlier in the year he was a running back 1. And that would put Samuels as a running back 2 in PPR leagues and a running back 4 in standards. If James Conner ends up sitting, I think Samuels becomes a running back 1 in PPRs and running back 2 in standards. I hope that makes sense there. If you have any questions, put it on the bottom like Christian said. Got Alvin Kamara. Steelers allow these 6 fewest points to running backs, but he's still a solid running back 1 in PPRs and a mid-range running back 2 in standards. Then you have Mark Ingram. I would sit Mark in PPRs. He's had great hands. He had 3 consecutive years where he averaged 50 catches per season. For whatever reason this year, he's just not being used in the passing game there, so I would sit him in PPR leagues. As far as standards go, he struggled even there running the ball a little bit there, and so he's a low-end running back 3. I remember he came back from suspension, had that one game that was good, and Alvin Kamara owners panicked. We had a lot of questions from you guys. Should we get rid? Should we trade Alvin Kamara? We said, don't worry about it. This is still Alvin's team, and it still is. Mark Ingram is clearly the number 2 back there. He's clearly not nearly the caliber that Kamara is, so that's kind of where I land with Mark Ingram. He is a running back 3, low-end play in standards. I would sit him in PPRs. As far as wide receivers go, you got Juju Smith-Schuster and Antonio Brown. New Orleans gives up the most points to wide receivers. I would start Brown and Juju both as wide receiver 1s in this matchup. I'm a Vikings fan. I love Diggs. I love Adam Thielen, but they are the best wide receiver duo in the league. They are phenomenal to watch. I love these guys. Then you have Michael Thomas. I would start as a wide receiver 1. Now, after Michael Thomas, there's just not enough targets to consistently trust going to other wide receivers. If I had to put my money on a guy after Michael Thomas, it would be Kirkwood, and even then I wouldn't trust him at this point. So definitely Michael Thomas is a wide receiver 1. The other guys are wide receiver 4s like Kirkwood and Traquan Smith, who showed a lot of potential. He's a wide receiver 5. He's really kind of fallen off the radar there. As far as tight ends go, Saints give up the 5th fewest points at tight ends. I would sit Vance McDonald, Jesse James, and I also sit Ben Watson in this game. As far as kickers go, I would sit Boswell. I would start Lutz. I would sit both defenses, but if you had to put your money on a defense, if you had to start one, it would be the Saints defense for me right now. That defense is trending in the right direction.
All right, so Rob had to take off real quick. Kind of a thing just popped up last minute for him. He's got to go take care of that, so he is gone. But it's just me and Ryan now, and he took care of his game, so it really doesn't matter. Ryan, you are up now for the Chiefs versus the Seahawks.
Yeah, right before he left, he said he was really excited about that Steelers-Saints game. I think this Chiefs and Seahawks game is going to be absolutely phenomenal. It's going to be explosive. Not quite like the Rams and Chiefs game that we had a couple of weeks ago, but so let's start with the quarterbacks. Kansas City Chiefs right now giving up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. You're definitely going to start Russell Wilson. They're giving up 25.9 points per game to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks. Russell Wilson has been very effective this year in low volume situations. He's completing a high percentage of his passes, and even in a game a couple of weeks ago, he had 17 pass attempts and had 4 touchdowns against the 49ers. So with Kansas City giving up so many points to opposing quarterbacks and the potential for the Chiefs to be ahead in this game, Russell Wilson's going to continue to need to throw the ball. So it's going to be a great game for Wilson. I have him as a top 5 play this week. And on the other side of the ball, Patrick Mahomes, what more can you say? You're starting this guy. He had a down game last week and still scored 18 fantasy points against the Chargers. He's definitely a top 5 play as well this week. Number 1 fantasy quarterback. He's got close to 45 touchdowns already. So Patrick Mahomes, you're definitely starting. And the Chiefs actually... the Seahawks actually giving up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks over the last 4 weeks at 22.9. So it's going to be a high-power game with both real good offenses. On to the running backs. For the Seattle Seahawks, they actually signed off the waivers there, Bo Scarborough. So that's actually a bad news for Rashad Penny this week. Looks like it's going to be Chris Carson and possibly some Mike Davis, but doesn't look like Penny's going to be coming back soon. But you're definitely going to want to start Chris Carson against the Chiefs. Chiefs giving up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing running backs over the last 4 weeks. So you're starting Chris Carson. I think Mike Davis, you're going to want to bench him as Carson's going to get all of the work. If there was more of a committee type situation like it has been in the past, Mike Davis might be a low-end running back 3, but in a lot of leagues, you're not going to want to be starting Mike Davis in your championships because he's not the number 1 guy. He's definitely the backup to Carson, and Carson had a great game last week against the 49ers. So as far as the Kansas City Chiefs go, we don't know if Spencer Ware is going to be back yet. Practice reports haven't come out for Wednesday. They do have a Sunday game, so Wednesday is going to be their first practice of the week, but if Spencer Ware does come back, all that really does for me is limit the value of Damian Williams. Williams looked awesome last week against the Chargers, getting all the time, 6 catches for 74 yards, ran the ball, 2 touchdowns, 30 fantasy points in PPR leagues. So Damian Williams right now without Spencer Ware is a mid-range running back 2 against the Seattle Seahawks, who are giving up the 8th most fantasy points over the last 4 weeks to opposing running backs. If Spencer Ware were to come back, I think that the Chiefs really like Spencer Ware. I think they want him to be the number 1 guy, but Damian Williams is still going to have value in PPR especially. So that would just kind of put both of those guys in running back 3 territory and limit the value of each of them as they kind of steal targets and timeshare carries from each other. So with no Spencer Ware, Williams is an RB2. With Spencer Ware, they move down into RB3 range this week against the Seahawks. On to the wide receivers. Obviously, we're starting Tyreek Hill. Seattle actually, even though they're giving up so many points to quarterbacks, they're only giving up the 17th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but Tyreek Hill could easily take 180 yards in a heartbeat, and he is one of the fastest players in the NFL. So having a great season, definitely a top 10 wide receiver on the season. He's going to be a top 10 wide receiver this week for me as well against the Seattle Seahawks. He might see some Shaq Griffin, but Griffin has been great, but at the same time, like I said, over the last 4 weeks, that team has given up some points to quarterbacks and some mid-range against wide receivers. So on the other side of the ball, I mean, you're looking at, I'm sorry, not the other side of the ball, but on the other side of the field for the Chiefs, no Sammy Watkins. Chris Conley has been limited in targets. Demarcus Robinson has been limited. He did get a touchdown last week. But there's really nobody that I trust. There's small sample sizes for all of those guys. Calvin Benjamin was starting to come on a little bit. Saw some more targets last week. Maybe he's getting the playbook down. So I guess Calvin Benjamin's like a wide receiver 4 for me this week. But I don't really think anybody other than Tyreek Hill you're going to want to bet on in your championship week. For the Seattle Seahawks now, the Kansas City Chiefs giving up quite a few fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. They're actually 5th in the last 4 weeks for most fantasy points. You're going to start Tyler Lockett. You're going to start Doug Baldwin. Baldwin had a great game last week, 77 yards and 2 touchdowns. Lockett is having a career year. He's basically scored on a high rate. He's got 9 touchdowns and only 51 catches this season so far. But with Russell Wilson being able to scramble around, let those guys get open, Baldwin and Lockett are the 2 guys you want to look at for the Seattle Seahawks this week. And I'm actually starting Lockett in one of my championships this week as a flex option. On to tight ends. Kansas City's given up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends over the last 4 weeks, but who are you really going to start? You're not starting Ed Dix, and you're not going to start Nick Vannett this week. So you're not starting either one of those tight ends for the Seattle Seahawks. And for the Chiefs, it's Travis Kelce. You don't even need to worry about it. Travis Kelce is phenomenal. He's definitely a top 2 tight end this season, so you're starting Travis Kelce. Defenses, I would sit both these defenses. Probably going to be quite a few fantasy points, quite a few total points given up for both teams, so I would sit these defenses and probably start both of the kickers, Harrison Butker and Sebastian Janikowski. Janikowski missed an extra point last week, but the Seahawks should be able to move the ball and get within his range. So he's got the most 50-yard field goals of all time of any kicker, so definitely within his range anytime you're within the 35-yard line.
All right. As always, guys, if you have a question about that game, you can just drop it in the comments section below. I'll answer it. Good job, Ryan. I'll get to the last game now. All right, so we have the Broncos versus the Raiders. Now, for starters, real simple here. You're not going to play Case Keenum. Despite the fact that he's got a good matchup against the Raiders who give up the 7th most fantasy points to quarterbacks, he's just been a terrible fantasy option. Over the last 5 games, he's averaging under 200 yards passing and less than a passing touchdown per game. The production simply isn't there. Now, Derek Carr is another guy who is in a very similar situation where the production hasn't quite been there, but it has been higher. He's a low-end quarterback play. He does have 6 passing touchdowns in the last 3 games. He's a guy where you can feel confident he's going to get you 1 or 2 touchdowns, but he doesn't have a lot of weapons there, so you can't expect too much from him, and Denver gives up the 13th fewest passing points to quarterbacks. So much like a lot of the guys that I've talked about today, if you're in a deep league, if you're desperate, yes, but otherwise, no. As always, we say look for a better option, keep your eyes open for talent, and that's how you can find some great plays. As far as the running backs go, Phillip Lindsay is a good play this week. Now, he has struggled in previous games. In fact, he combined for just 54 rushing yards over the past 2 weeks. But the Raiders give up 146 rushing yards per game this season, and Lindsay has 8 touchdowns in the last 8 games. He's a touchdown machine. I think you got to start him as a running back too. On the other side, Doug Martin. Now, Doug Martin has not topped 61 rushing yards in 7 straight games, and the Broncos are actually a pretty good defense as far as stopping running backs, giving up the 13th fewest fantasy points to running backs. So I don't like Doug Martin this week unless you don't have any better options. As far as the wide receivers go, this game is honestly quite shallow as far as the wideouts go. Maybe the best one is Courtland Sutton. He has caught 5 of 6 targets for 42 yards last week, which is pretty good, but not amazing. And I really do like, though, that he plays against the Raiders, who've given up a league-worst 32 passing touchdowns this season. I think that Cortland Sutton is a wide receiver 3 play, solid wide receiver 3 play, but not quite a wide receiver 2 play, mostly because of his role as that number 1 wideout. Really, the only wide receiver worth mentioning for the Raiders is Jordy Nelson. Jordy Nelson has really struggled to find the end zone, but he's had 3 good weeks in a row. Other than that, 3 weeks ago he had 11 targets, 10 catches, and 97 yards. 2 weeks ago he had 7 for 6 catches and 48 yards, and then last week he had 8 targets, 6 catches, and 88 yards. So in a PPR league, you can plug him in as a wide receiver 3, but remember, he is on the low end. I guess you can, fingers crossed, he'll find the end zone this week. You're going to sit all Denver tight ends, and you're going to start Jared Cook. Jared Cook hasn't been amazing, but he's been pretty good. The tight end position, as we talk about, has next to no talent. In the last 5 games, he's had 2 games with over 100 yards receiving and 3 touchdowns. And then you top that with a good matchup against Denver, who gives up the 5th most fantasy points to tight ends. He is certainly worth a play this week. As far as the kickers go, you're going to sit Daniel Carlson. You're going to start Brandon McManus. He hasn't been an amazing kicker, but he goes up against the Raiders, who give up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers, so this could be a good week for him. Denver is a low-end defense play. They're going to get you about 7 to 10 fantasy points this week is kind of my projection range. They haven't been amazing, but Oakland gives up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing defenses, and so in that sense they're a good matchup. And Oakland, you're going to sit them. Not only does Denver give up the 7th fewest fantasy points to defenses, Oakland has been awful as a fantasy defense. This really doesn't need to be said, but I'm going to read it off anyways. In their last 10 games, here are their fantasy totals. 1 point, 3 points, -4, -1, 4, 5, 4, 0, 3, and 2. Absolutely atrocious. They're getting you next to an average of just barely above 0. Honestly, it's just awful. I don't know how a defense can struggle that bad. But anyways, guys, that's my pretty simple breakdown for that game. Guys, go down in the comments section below. Tell us if you have any additional thoughts that you'd like to add, any questions that you have. Of course, there should be less questions this week because it's a championship week. Honestly, we do get a lot less views, and so we will be on that answering every single question. As always, guys, we thank you so much for watching. You have a great day, and God bless. There we go.